A last disorder that winds up being interesting. There is a type of epilepsy which, when you have it, something happens to your religious belief system. And this is one of its characteristic features. Epileptic seizures, as I think we've discussed in here, have characteristics as to what part of the brain they originate in. And this is epilepsy that originates in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe containing the hippocampus, the amygdala. It's a big limbic area. The temporal lobe epilepsy. And about 30 years ago, a neurologist named Geschwin, who was at Harvard, who was probably the most influential neurologist of the 20th century, Geschwin published a paper first describing what is now called temporal lobe personality, which is a cluster of personality traits that become far more common in people with temporal lobe epilepsy. Once again, not everybody with this personality profile has epilepsy lurking there. Not everybody with temporal lobe epilepsy gets this profile, but statistically at a higher than expected rate. What do you see with temporal lobe personality? First off, the person becomes extremely serious and humorless. Okay, you might say, I would become extremely serious and humorless if I suddenly came down with epilepsy. What's the appropriate control? Looking at other types of epilepsies of equivalent severity, it's specific to temporal lobe. So you get the seriousness. Next thing you get is what is termed neophobia. You don't like new things. You like to just do very familiar sorts of stuff, the same small circle of friends, the same very relatively limited range of experiences. Okay, if I had epilepsy, I would suddenly get a lot more sort of involuted in my lifestyle. Once again, the controls are other types of epilepsies. Next thing you see is this bizarre trait called hypergraphia, which is people with temporal lobe personality begin to write obsessively. They feel a pressured need to write. Fourth trait, and the most interesting one of all, is people with temporal lobe personality become obsessively interested in religious and philosophical subjects. And these are not people with uncontrolled seizures happening all the time. These are people whose seizures are relatively well controlled with medication. And once again, well, if I had this horrible neurological disease, I'd suddenly start getting more introspective about, once again, control for with the other types of epilepsy. And the classic temporal lobe patient that you see is somebody who is meeting a new neurologist and says, oh, hi, great to meet you. You know, I very strongly believe that a patient should be more than just their symptoms. So I've prepared this 60-page document here, which is my philosophy about life and meaning, and if the next week's appointment comes back with a 40-page addendum, this is what you wind up seeing. And there's this fabulous story told showing that it's not that you get religious, you get interested in religious and philosophical subjects. This great story showing this. And this was apparently shortly after Geschwin first published this paper. And he had some neurology resident who one day, all the residents were in there, and the neurology resident was summarizing some patient. This was some 13-year-old boy in there with temporal lobe epilepsy. And he went through the meds and all of that and how the kid was doing. And at the end said, oh, by the way, I just read your paper on that personality stuff. This kid doesn't fit at all. Doesn't fit in the slightest. Clearly doing some chest-thumping kind of territorial stuff with the big man there. And Geschwin says, oh, yeah, really? How come? And he said, because I asked him if he's religious. He said, no, he's not. Geschwin says, idiot, out of my way. Like, pushes him and goes storming down the hall, and the resident's running after him, bursts into this kid's room and says, oh, hi, I'm Dr. Geschwin, and puts him through a neurological exam and all of that, and goes through and asks him, does he like baseball, how's the weather, all of that, and then offhandedly says, oh, by the way, are you religious? And the boy says, no, I'm not. And then Geschwin asks the critical question. He says, oh, how come? And this 13-year-old kid gives this hour-long lecture about the internal inconsistencies of Christ's Sermon on the Mount and the Epic of Gilgamesh and sort of Enkidu's treatment of this and Bertrand Russell's critique of Christ. And like Geschwin just leaves the residents in their torture to listen to this kid for an hour. And it's not becoming religious, it's becoming fascinated with the subject. And there's even been a paper published in a neurology journal doing this sort of paleoforensic neurology by a neurologist speculating someone who in history had temporal lobe epilepsy, and this was St. Paul. St. Paul, who had seizure auras, as documented. No evidence that the guy was particularly humorous. The guy was hypergraphic as hell, and clearly had a very strong interest in religious and philosophical subjects. And, you know, this is fun, but what do you make of the fact that somebody has an uncontrolled seizure in this part of the brain for 30 seconds once every 6 months, and they become more interested in religious subjects?